And Mr. President, I see that I've been joined on the floor by the senator from Florida, and I would ask unanimous consent to engage in a colloquy with Senator Nelson.
Without objection, so ordered. Senator from Florida is recognized.
Mr. President, I thank my colleague for his leadership, and I want to ask my colleague if he is aware of the testimony that the commanding general of U.S. Southern Command, General Kelly, Marine four-star general, has given to the Armed Services Committee and to the Foreign Relations Committee recently in the last couple of weeks.
Mr. President, I am aware of the testimony of General Kelly, but given his role at SOCOM, and in particular its location in Florida, and the fact that the senator from Florida was there for the testimony, I would ask him to remind us exactly what General Kelly had to say about how we are, or in some cases are not, interdicting and dealing with the flow of narcotics, and particularly cocaine, that has been at the root of so much of the instability and violence that we see in these three Central American countries today.
And Mr. President, the senator from New Mexico has put his finger on exactly the root cause of the problem. It's the substantial loads of cocaine that are coming into these three Central American countries that because of the violence, because of the killing, as a result, the parents, they have three choices when their child gets on up toward their teenage years. Their first choice is to let their kid join the gang, because the gangs, and these gangs are criminal gangs, and they're tied in with the drug lords, and the drug lords have taken over the country because of all the money that's being made from these big shipments that come in. So the parents have three choices. Number one, let their kid join the gang. Number two, go to their child's funeral. Or number three, they become subject to the subtle and direct plea by the coyotes, oh, for $1,500, $5,000, we can get your kid to the border, and your child will be safe in America. Now, why those three countries? Why are the children that have been showing up in the last several months at the border, why are the children not coming from Belize, from Nicaragua, from Costa Rica, from Panama? They're coming from three countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, because that's where the big shipments of drugs are coming from South America into there in a boat, 1 to 3 tons of cocaine. Once they get on land, they break them down into small packages, and they go through a very efficient distribution system that is drugs and criminal elements. They can distribute just about anything they want, including trafficking in humans, and they're going north. So if Honduras is the murder capital of the world, and if El Salvador and Guatemala are not far behind, how do you get at that immediately to stop the flow of children going north? You interdict more effectively the drug shipments. And that's what the United States has been so successful. And so General Kelly, the commanding general of all of U.S. Southern Command, tells us that sadly he has to sit there with his joint interagency task force all the agencies of the U.S. government arrayed together in this joint interagency task force that is headquartered in Key West. And they have to watch 74% of primarily these boats, not as much flights, primarily boats, because they can carry big, big loads of cocaine. Get through. So, what this senator has been doing, I mean, if it gets to the point of voting for the supplemental, I will certainly vote for it, but it doesn't get additionally to the root cause of the problem. What we have done, and I have shared this with as many people as I can, consulting with General Kelly, they've boiled this down to $122 million out of this president's request of $3.7 billion, of which the Senate Appropriations Committee has pared that down to $2.7 billion. This senator is asking for $122 million. And it will cover such things as $31 million for maritime patrol craft working through our interagency, U.S. government interagency task force, such as $40 million for maritime patrol requirements to deploy U.S. Coast Guard law enforcement detachments, such as $15 million for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance by putting up contractor-owned predators 24 hours a day, 5 days a week. That contract is being drawn up. If we did this, General Kelly could execute that contract immediately. Then you'd start to see some results.
So if I understand the senator from Florida correctly, General Kelly literally simply does not have the resources to do the job that we have done historically in terms of interdicting cocaine moving north for the market that frankly is in North America.
That is correct.
In the United States and Canada, and has to literally sit there and watch these narcotics go by without being able to have the resources to stop them in their tracks.
The senator is correct, and whereas General Kelly, and I'm just using him as the symbol, as the four-star general, it's the Joint Interagency Task Force. In Key West, it's actually headed by a Coast Guard admiral. They can interdict and do interdict about 25% of those big shipments coming from South America, coming through the Caribbean on the east, coming through the Pacific on the west. And because they've been effective at 25% of the shipments, what we're seeing is a shifting of those shipments. They're now actually sending more of them to the east, not only to the Dominican Republic and Haiti, but now to Puerto Rico, which is a U.S. territory. You get those drugs into Puerto Rico, that's American territory. They can ship them by mail from there to the rest of the U.S. and avoid detection.
And my understanding is that the resource situation in Southern Command has changed so dramatically in recent years that not only is this interagency task force limited, but that they have literally canceled more than 200 engagement activities and multilateral exercises with our partners to the region who can multiply that effect and interdict even more of these narcotics as they're moving forward.
That is, the senator is correct. And as a matter of fact, the staff of the Senate Appropriations Committee, who I have consulted with, is well familiar with the great operation of the Joint Interagency Task Force to go after these drugs. And as the senator from New Mexico says, you can imagine their frustration when they know about the boat shipment, and sometimes they can watch it from their overhead assets, and they can't do anything about it. And as a result, look what has happened over the last several months, of which we're trying to solve that problem of all these children showing up at the border. We ought to help solve that problem, but we need to go back and stop it at the very beginning of what is causing this problem.
Now, this senator from Florida also, Mr. President, brought up another issue that I think is worth exploring, and it's my understanding that he was recently briefed on the relationship that exists between these drug cartels and the entities that are actually engaging in human trafficking and moving people for a fee through Central America, through Mexico, and to the U.S. border. Can you tell us a little bit about the nature of that relationship?
The senator is correct on how all of these things are interlocked. You can imagine that when drugs come in of sufficient quantities that are worth so much, how that is a corrupting influence on any kind of law and order. And thus, the systems of governments, even though, and I just met, Senator Kane and I both met with the president of Honduras. He's trying as hard as he can. He's got a bounty on his head by these drug lords because he is opposing them. The judicial system is corrupted. The local police are corrupted. Okay, when that happens, then you can imagine when there are other criminal activities to occur, in addition to running drugs north, ultimately into the U.S., other drug activities such as human trafficking, such as any other kind of illegal activities, and potentially also terrorists being utilized in these efficient delivery networks, then it's all the more a threat to the national security interest of the U.S. And I think the U.S. Congress, the U.S. administration better wake up to the fact of what's happening right down there under our nose and get at this, in addition to solving the problems that we see that are a symptom, ultimately, of what is the root cause, the creation of a whole criminal network that is in large part fueled by the drug trade.
You know, if the senator from Florida will yield for a minute, the sad thing is, it didn't used to be this way in this part of Central America. And I know for a fact because my wife and I traveled there 15, 16 years ago, traveled extensively in Honduras, all across that country. And at that time, these gangs simply did not have the influence. There was not the level of destabilization. There wasn't the murder rate. You know, I always joke about trying to drive into Tegucigalpa, and I wouldn't recommend it for somebody who hasn't had plenty of time to acclimate to the speed and crush of cars in that capital city. But it was a completely different country at the time. And we traveled extensively in urban areas, in San Pedro Sula, in rural areas like Santa Rosa de Copan. And it was an economically challenged country. And for those folks who have claimed that all of these immigrants are simply heading north out of economic desperation, the economic situation has not changed all that much. And it's worth looking at the rest of Central America because surrounding countries, Belize and Costa Rica and other countries in Central America are also seeing refugees from these countries. And Nicaragua, which has substantial economic challenges right now, is losing economic immigrants, and those immigrants are not making it to our southern border in any substantial numbers. In fact, not less than a year ago, I was in Costa Rica, and many Nicaraguans are working in Costa Rica because the economy is better there. But yet we don't see them showing up in the numbers, especially as unaccompanied minors, as basically 7, 8, 10, 12-year-olds showing up at our border by themselves that are being driven by the extreme violence that we've seen in these three nations where the drug cartels have such a disproportionate influence on their country's stability.
If the senator would yield, just to underscore his point, we can look at the extraordinary success of Plan Colombia. Now, outside of Central America, go a little further south, and you're in the continent of South America, and lo and behold, 15, 20 years ago, Colombia was a place that in large part of Colombia, it was controlled by elements that were controlled by the drug lords. With the assistance of the United States, with extraordinary heroism on the part of the government of Colombia, over the course of years, you've seen the government of Colombia be able to take back control of most of its country. And even though cocaine is still grown there and the FARC is still operating, nevertheless, they are a diminished insurrection and criminal element of which there used to be a time that for us visiting a place like Bogota, the capital city, it really wasn't safe for us to go out alone walking on the streets. Now you can easily walk on the streets. It's a changed situation. So we're seeing the same thing replicated now in Central America, where the drug lords have basically taken over by buying off people with considerable money. And therefore, it makes it very difficult to have the rule of law in those struggling governments like the president of Honduras, who is trying so hard to bring back his country.
Senator from Florida will yield for a moment. You know, having formerly served on the House Armed Services Committee, I know that Department of Defense budget is something on the order of $550 billion. Surely SOCOM, Southcom, must have a substantial amount of resources to be able to meet this, right? Of that $550 billion, does the senator from Florida know how much actually goes to Southern Command?
Well, what this senator knows is that before the sequester started hitting the defense budget, even though we were conducting a war in two countries, Afghanistan and Iraq, with all the multiplicity of threats that are around in the region, including now what we see, ISIS, between Syria and northern and western Iraq, the Department of Defense had to make some hard choices. They had to cut back because of this mindless budgetary meat axe called the sequester. And as a result, they had to set their priorities. And when it came to it, they had to support the troops out in the field and had to cut back in other commands. U.S. Southern Command is one of those commands that was cut back. But now we're seeing the lack of wisdom to these budgetary policies, sequester, and the scarcity when you cannot allocate the defense resources and other agencies, because remember, this is a joint interagency task force. We are now seeing the effects of that in what has been on the front pages of the newspapers about all the children coming to the border. Now, by the way, the children are just a diminutive percentage of the total people still coming to the border. I can't remember if it's 20%, 40%, but it's something well less than half of all the people that are still coming to the border. But of course, the children, because of the humanitarian crisis with them, are the ones that have gotten the attention. So if we know there's a problem, how do we fix the problem? We ought to go back to the root cause, and that's the case that I've been making on that side of the aisle, on this side of the aisle, and yet we're at this point of impasse, and needless to say, it's very frustrating to this senator.
Well, I want to thank the senator from Florida for continuing to advocate for this. I know that Southern Command's annual budget now is about $1 billion, or literally $1 billion out of the $550 billion in the Department of Defense. And given our strategic, the necessity of engaging with Central and South America on these issues, I think it's time to reevaluate in terms of both resources, but also in terms of priorities, how we look at Central and South America, to re-engage with our neighbors and try to address some of these issues at the root level instead of always at the symptom level. And I see with that we've been joined by our esteemed chair of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Mikulski from Maryland. So with that, I thank you, Mr. President, for allowing the senator from Florida and I to indulge in this colloquy. And once again, I want to say how much I hope we take this opportunity to do something, not just about the symptoms and the current crisis, which has to be dealt with, but also the underlying causes of this crisis.